The black hair. He had married beneath him. That was the opinion of his mother. He ought to have married a wealthy woman of class. But he had been unable to imagine a time when he would not have his own prestige as a samurai and the resources that were presumed to go with it. He had married for love, a diminutive, pale-skinned beauty, as young and innocent as a newly hatched dove. She had captured his heart. She had none of the airs and manners of wealthy, well-brought-up young women, but she had a modest charm that overcame his senses. He had wanted only to cherish and protect her, to marry her, yes, and love her forever. This, his heart cried out to him, and he had obeyed. On the wedding day, she had neither wrapped her hair in silk nor piled it high with elegant combs. The black hair fell in an ebony cascade over her delicate shoulders and down her back like a waterfall, all the way to her knees and beyond. Shining like the wing of a wood pigeon in the sun, her beautiful black hair was all the wedding veil she wore or needed. How he had loved her! They moved into the house with his mother. It was an old house, built by a grandfather and added to by each generation until it became a maze of rooms, each of a different size and shape. There was a basement that had been used for storage and later finished as the family grew, but was now unused. The house was on the edge of town and much too big for the three of them, but they believed that children and later grandchildren would fill the many rooms. The samurai's lord was wealthy and his pay was good. Of course he was away from home often. That was the samurai's lot. Tournaments, battle practice, now and then an actual battle. Between these excursions, he sometimes went with the village men to hunt stag or gamble. He had freedom to do as he pleased. Apart from duty to his lord, a samurai did as he pleased in his own town, in his own home. His lovely bride never complained of loneliness, not even after his mother passed on, leaving her completely alone in the big house. She seemed content with her silk weaving. Her work had won recognition at village fairs and, he supposed, commanded a good price. Of course he did not encourage this practice, but it was a pastime she had before they married, work that contributed to the meager resources of her family. It made her happy, so he let it continue. He didn't know what she did with the money. He didn't care. Probably she gave it to her relations. He provided for everything she could want, easily, as her wants were small and she asked for little. She always greeted his return with ecstatic joy. She was sweet-tempered, a perfect wife in every way. Yes, his life with her was good. Change came, as it must. 2 serious battles found his lord defeated. After the second defeat, his boss disappeared. Money stopped coming. The samurai never knew if the warlord had died of his wounds or had simply run away. Most of the warriors were either dead or crippled. There was no one left to fight. He had to accept the fact that he had no lord. He was no longer a samurai, but a ronin, a warrior for hire, without a master, without a place in the world, without funds. The proper action now, of course, was seppuku, but he had no intention of that. He was still young, still strong, still handsome. He need not give up the battle of life so easily. He was devastated by the loss of face, the loss of position and respect he had taken for granted. But money was the most insistent problem. There was none. None except what his wife brought in with her pathetic weaving. The loom clacked away for hours every day. She scarcely stopped long enough to prepare his meals. Once a week, she took the work to a silk merchant, returning with a few coins and all the food she could carry. He came to hate the sight of her plodding along, carrying those shimmering bolts on her back, making her bend forward like an old woman. Why, she was years younger than he was. What right had she to look like that? And he came to hate the sound of the loom clacking, an insistent reproach to his own inadequacy. He had been a great warrior, and now he was nothing, a ronin supported by his pathetic wife. The thought enraged him. His mother, it turned out, was right. He had married beneath him. He could have had any woman in the village, any woman at his lord's court. He could have chosen from women of wealth and style. But no, he had married this pitiful creature. What a mistake that was. But the world never turns without bringing more change, and so it was that his well-earned fame as a warrior brought him an opportunity to rise again. Another lord wanted him, a rich and powerful ruler. It was, in fact, the very lord whose samurai had defeated his own lord. They could have killed him then, but chose not to. They didn't need to kill him. He was disarmed and dishonored. That was enough. Now he was supposed to join with them. He didn't see how he could refuse. He didn't want to refuse. He wanted to stand tall again, to wear the colors and swords of a true samurai. It was nothing less than he deserved. He would leave this big old house and the reproachful clacking of the loom. He would leave this pathetic woman. She could keep the house. She was still pretty enough and young. She would be all right. And with one word, he divorced her. "I am going to a distant city," he said. "I am going to a new life where I mean to be at court. I plan to make a high place for myself with my new lord. I don't see how you could ever fit in. You should find yourself a new husband, one who can support you better than I can, for I can't support you at all if I stay here." She begged him not to go. "I can earn more if I weave longer each day," she cried. Then she begged him to take her with him. He saw how much she loved him, and it caused him pain, for he did not return that feeling, not now, at least, if he ever had. Luckily there were no children. She would be all right. Of course she would. He flung his bundle across his shoulders and made for the front gate. The last thing he saw was her long black hair unbound, floating around her in the evening breeze, and her last words stayed with him to haunt his journey. "I pray that you change your mind," she cried. "Come back to me. I will not leave. I will be here waiting." When he reached the city of his new lord, he was welcomed with a celebration. He was given money and a fine ceremonial sword. Determined to win a high place, he denied himself pleasures indulged by the other samurai. He did not drink or trifle with the women made available to him. Instead, he practiced long hours with bow and arrow and with the sword. He practiced daily maneuvers on horseback. He groomed himself like a feathered bird and maintained an aloof demeanor at court, nevertheless discreetly eyeing the high-born women, seeking a favorable match. Older now and smarter, he plotted a careful path to a successful future. Like a well-played chess match, his fortune began to manifest itself. The Lord himself took note of his dedication, his well-honed skills, and his exceptional performance at tournament. The women of the court took note as well, and he soon saw that he could have his pick. They were beautiful women, well trained in grace and Japanese tradition, but his strategy did not include any of them. He continued to preen and tantalize the women until he was certain he had the full interest of the prize he sought, the daughter of his lord. She was as beautiful as any of the others, coiffed, draped, and painted to perfection by women skilled in these arts. He had been exchanging glances with her for a few weeks when her father invited him to a private dinner and suggested that the samurai would be a perfect husband for his beautiful virgin daughter. He proposed to her that night. After a proper amount of shy fan play and giggles, she accepted, and the wedding soon followed. What a magnificent bride she was, swaddled in fine red silk, yards and yards of it trailing behind her, delicately carried by 6 modest maidens in kimonos bearing the insignia of their royal lines. There was a banquet. The court musicians played until dawn. As tradition required, he carried the bride away to the wedding chamber. His physical condition was as good as it had ever been, but he nearly staggered under the weight of the bride. There was more to her than he guessed under the flowing silk. Though impatient to satisfy a physical urge long held in check, he resolved to be a patient and tender lover. After all, she was a woman of class and a virgin. She excused herself, and he heard whispering behind the screen. Evidently one or more of her attendants was helping her prepare. He lay down on the mat to wait for her and fell immediately asleep. He awoke suddenly, confused and uncertain where he was. His bride lay next to him. He could not see her, but he could hear her breath, shallow, intense breaths, as of one seething in anger. He reached out his hand to touch her. She drew back. "Oh, you're awake, I see," she said bitterly. Angry she might be, high-bred and rich and her father's daughter she might be, but she was his bride, and he was still a man. He pulled her roughly against him and kissed her with passion. She was a big woman, and her rounded breasts and thighs aroused him. He thought only briefly of the butterfly lightness of his former wife. In his passion, he nearly forgot his resolve to treat her with patience and tenderness. There was, after all, no need for it. This was no innocent girl, as her father had promised, but a well-experienced sexual expert, hungry for his body, insatiable. She soon made him know her expectations, and they were many. He was expected to attend teas, where she showed him off like a prize stallion. He was required to read to her, to run errands, to dress according to her taste, and most importantly, to be available at bedtime and any other time the inclination struck her. He did have his own chamber, but it was clear that sleeping there, rather than with her, would draw a fierce blade of displeasure, polished with the unspoken threat of complaints to her father. She never did complain to her father, though. She was too much consumed with pride to let anyone in her family imagine that there was the slightest problem in her marriage. It didn't take long for him to break. He simply could not keep up with her demands. His life had become a prison, and a stage play in which he had more and more performance demands with fewer and fewer lines to speak, dominated by the haughty, petulant woman he had married. Though he fought against it, he found endless fault with her. She was old, he thought. She must be at least 10 years older than he believed her to be at first. She was corpulent. Her skin was sticky with oils and unpleasant to touch. Her hair was stiff from lacquers used to hold her fashionable hairstyles. Her voice had the rasping edge of a rusty knife. And she nagged. God, how she nagged! He wanted out. But if he left her, he would lose rank with her father. He could be sent away, returned to the battlefield, or, more likely, dismissed altogether. He filled up the hours with memories of his first wife, the softness of her skin, her gently yielding body, her sweet voice, the scent of her long, supple black hair enwrapping him. He dwelt as much as he could in that fantasy. Now came the realization that he loved the woman he had left, that his selfish pride had tricked him into wounding and leaving behind the only thing he had ever loved. Yes, he was well and truly trapped. Short of leaving, what could he do about it? Like a caged animal, his mind paced from moment to moment without thought or plan. To avoid his wife, he came later and later to bed. She would send her servant to summon him, always with some innocent request. Often he declined on a pretext that he was in the midst of some uninterruptible task. Finally, he stopped sleeping with her altogether, though they kept up their performance as a happily married couple in public. Deprived of his company in the bedroom, she grew more shrewish and demanding. She created scenes when they were alone, calling him a dishonorable mercenary, disparaging his manhood, and delivering such curses as a woman of her class ought never have learned. In his mind, he heard only the gentle voice of his first wife begging him to come home, promising that she would wait for him forever for his return. At last, a day came when the door of his cage was left open, and he fled like a wild animal escaping captivity and racing to its lair. That day, the house of his Lord was empty of everyone except servants, too in awe to question his actions. He returned the fine sword he had been given years ago, placing it in the chamber of his Lord, hoping this atoned for the ingratitude to his master and the insult to his daughter's honor. Of course it did not. Nothing could. Perhaps returning the sword showed not only the intention of honor, but would convey to his master his desperation. After all, the man had known her all her life, and must have some idea of the harridan he had raised. He took all the money he had cashed. It wasn't much, for his wife was an extravagant woman, but it would be enough to last until he reached his village. At least he hoped it would. He left everything else, taking only the clothes he stood in and the sword he carried when he came. Night was falling when he left, but he was too full of pent-up energy to rest, and he traveled all night, recalling the highway as if he had traveled it yesterday. At dawn, he slept for an hour by the road. He bought food and drink from a vendor in the first small town. Near the end of his journey, he arrived at a temple. the same temple where he took shelter before. How different things were now. Then he had been full of ambition, his jaw set with the determination to succeed, his mind racing with plans for great accomplishment. He had been free as the air and relished the feeling. Now his mind was calm and focused. He cared nothing for success or failure. He had only one idea: to reach home, and hold in his arms the woman he loved. To reach home and begin the impossible task of atonement. It was the same priest as before, only his hair had turned white. His face was exactly the same, kindly and unlined. He told the priest where he was going and what he had learned. "I only hope she did wait," he said, giving voice to his fear. "She said she would, but I've been gone so long, she might have found someone else or moved away. Yet I feel sure in my heart she is waiting still. I feel her sometimes, so close I could put my hand out and touch hers. Or I feel the breath of her long, beautiful hair on my cheek. Did I tell you she had the longest, most beautiful black hair?" The priest nodded encouragement and talked to him of many things, spiritual things, as priests are likely to talk about. The samurai barely listened. The priest did not scold him for his wrongs. He only smiled benignly, offering him shelter and food for another day, should he wish to rest and meditate. But he could not rest. His heart was bursting with anticipation. He had to get home. Night was falling when he arrived at his village. He passed his wife's family home, surprised to see it completely dark and abandoned. At a tavern, no one even remembered the family. Only one old man remembered his wife. "That woman with the long black hair lived in a big old house all alone. I remember her. She used to sell bolts of silk," he recalled. "Does she sell them still?" the samurai asked impatiently. "Oh, I don't know. I imagine she does. I don't get out much now." The samurai, who was no longer a samurai, nor even a ronin, perceived that the old man was drunk. He would soon enough see for himself. He rushed along the street and then up a hill where stood the darkened shape of his old home. And was that? Yes, he was sure he saw a light from a window at the back. The garden was deep in tall grass. Weeds had grown up between the stepping stones and covered the path. He took the stairs two at a time, and his weight made them groan like a ship in the storm. Inside, all was dark and still. He made his way slowly from room to room. In the great antechamber, his foot went through a rotten board, and the sound was ear-splitting. What had happened? What terrible poverty had he left her to? Remorse seized his heart anew as he inched through the darkness toward the corner where he thought he saw light. He became conscious of a sound, not loud, rhythmic and familiar, the clack-clacking of his wife's loom. She was in the house weaving silk even after darkness had fallen. Ah, the blessed clack-clacking of that loom! He stumbled forward toward a faint glow that must be her workroom. He called out to her. "My love," he cried, "my beloved!" The clacking of the loom went on for a moment and then ceased. A panel opened and light spilled onto the floor in front of him. In the opening, a tiny silhouette, his wife's delicate form, was there before him, her long black hair cascading nearly to the floor. The gates of heaven stood open. He ran to her, enfolded her in his arms, kissed her fragrant hair and the silken skin of her face and shoulders and arms. He wept. "Forgive me," he cried. "I was a fool, and I paid the price of my foolishness. I have suffered most from missing your sweet nature and sweet, kind ways. Can you ever forgive me?" He had forgotten how beautiful her voice was, like the sound of a tiny bell or softly plucked strings. Sweet, sweeter than honey, that voice and the generous words she spoke. "There is nothing to forgive. If there ever was, I forgave you the day you left. I always prayed that you would return to me, even if only for a single night. And now at last my prayers are answered, and that night has come." "A single night? Oh no! I am home to stay. I will never leave you, no matter what. Please believe that." "I do believe that," she cried. "Hold me tightly as you used to. You have given me all that I ever could ask of this world, my love." She brought him tea and rice cakes and roasted pigeon. The meal took little preparation, appearing as if by magic. At least she had not deprived herself of food. How beautiful she was! How magical the evening! She spread a fine silk cover on the mat, and they lay down together. He ran his hands over her flesh, as he had done so many times in imagination. He gathered handfuls of her supple black hair and wrapped it around their naked bodies, as he had done on their wedding night. He felt the acrimony had accumulated during the past years washed away in the ecstasy of their loving. If a man can die and go to heaven and still be alive, then I have done it, he thought. Eventually, sleep overtook him. He awoke to the gray light of early dawn coming through the curtains. The curtains were beyond worn. There were only tattered rags hanging in the window. My God, how she must have struggled. But he was home now. Things would change. It was true he had lost his profession and knew no other. He wouldn't have the first idea how to repair the stairway or the rotted floor. But he knew the men of the town. He had hunted and gambled with them. He was sure they would apprentice him until he learned how to be a householder instead of a warrior. In time he would find paying work. He would earn his place as man of the house. All would be well. As daylight came boldly through the windows, he noticed that the cover on which they lay was almost as tattered as the curtains. His heart contracted. Such poverty! Her long black hair was still spread over his body. He noticed streaks of gray that he hadn't seen before. Well, his own hair had a bit of gray already. It was natural. He wondered briefly if she would look as lovely in the morning night as she had in the soft glow of lanterns the night before. He thought she would, and smiling, careful not to move suddenly and wake her, he turned to look upon the face of his beloved. Inside a white stark skull, two empty sockets stared back, and all of her white teeth grinned at him with the final irony of death. A terrible animal cry shook the walls and infused him with fear. It was his own voice, a voice he had never heard before. Every fiber of his body urged him to push aside the mess of bones and straggly hair in which he found himself naked and entangled, to flee, to escape from this hell house, to run for his life. But, paralyzed with horror, he could only lie there as if bound by steel, staring at the remains of his beautiful wife. And they were her remains, no doubt of it. Even without the familiar amulet hung round her neck, he would have been sure it was her. For beyond the putrefaction of death, the long black hair, faded and lifeless, retained the faint fragrance of her that he remembered well. At last pride came to his rescue. Why, he was paralyzed like a frightened child. And by what? By nothing more than the remains of a tiny woman whom he could have subdued with one hand in life. Was he supposed to be a warrior? He had looked upon the face of death many times in battle, scenes more horrific than this one. He had watched brave men expire with their bloody entrails lying on the ground. He had smelled the gore of fresh death, and he never ran and never looked away. Surely he could stand this. These bones deserved burial, deserved a burial of honor in the cemetery of the world. His duty was clear. Later, he would tell himself that the night had been a dream, that he had arrived exhausted, drank sake, and passed out dreaming that his beloved was with him again. But that lie would have to wait. With the long black hair still wrapped around him, he knew that she had waited for him to return, waited even beyond death, waited for her prayer to be answered, a single night with him. Thinking of her loyalty and patience, the priest's words came back to him. He had talked about heavenly realms and how one could enter when the law of karma is satisfied. But some souls, the priest had said, when they reach the entry to nirvana, they turn back to the suffering of the world, compelled to return and bring relief, if they could, to those still chained to the wheel of karma. They refuse to enter heaven as long as even one soul suffers on earth. These souls are called the Bodhisattva. He wrapped the fragile bones in her long black hair and wrapped everything together in an unfinished bolt of silk he cut from the loom. He carried them to the monastery, where the priest prepared a burial service. First, the bones were burned. The priest said this would free her spirit from the bonds of this world. Then they buried her remains in the holy ground of the monastery. The samurai, who was no longer a samurai, nor even a ronin, remained at the monastery for the rest of his days, where he ministered to travelers needing help and nourished his own soul from the wisdom of the monks.